What's up, everyone? Welcome to TYT. I'm your host, Anna Kasparian, and we have not only a fantastic show ahead for you guys today, but this week is going to be a little different. Cenk Uygur is out for the remainder of the week. I'll be hosting the first hour solo up until Thursday, and we're going to have guest hosts for the second hour, starting with Francesca Fiorentini for the second hour today. She's also going to stay tuned, stay with us for the bonus episode following the main show, and of course that is exclusive for our members. So if you want to watch that, you can become a member by clicking on the join button if you're watching us on YouTube, or go to tyt.com/join to become a member if you're watching us on any other platform. The show today is full of pretty complex and substantive stories, but we will lighten it up in the second hour and the bonus episode. We'll talk about Aaron Rodgers deciding to piggyback off of nonsense, ridiculous talking points about the election being stolen from Donald Trump. Incredibly irresponsible and stupid. We'll get to that later. In the first hour, we're gonna have a guest today. We're gonna talk to Latasha Brown, who is the co-founder of Black Voters Matter. We're gonna talk about the fate of the voting rights bill, along with Joni Ernst and her recent comments in regard to Iowa's voter suppression laws. We'll also talk a little bit about the United States and NATO aggression toward Russia. I have a take on that story that I think might turn some of you off, because the overwhelming narrative in the mainstream press, not just today, but over the last few years, has been pro-war toward Russia. And I think that's incredibly irresponsible. I'll give you the details and the receipts for why I think that. But before we get to all of that, I think we need to start off with an update on a super important story involving Representative Henry Cuellar of Texas.
Federal agents searching the home of Congressman Henry Cuellar 24 hours ago, authorities taking items out of the house. Tonight, the FBI confirming it was a, quote, court-authorized operation.
Now, last week, we learned that corporate Democrat Henry Cuellar was raided by the FBI. It was a pretty shocking story, but we had few, if any, details in regard to what the raid was about. Well, now we have some more details, and we had speculated that corruption might have something to do with it. Lo and behold, now we learn about his increasingly shady ties with the oil company in Azerbaijan, and how foreign money might have flowed into the pockets of various members of Congress. But Cuellar certainly has been one of the biggest advocates for the Azerbaijani government. I'll give you the details based on reporting by The Intercept. So The Intercept writes that while little is known about the specific FBI probe, which involves the Department of Justice's Public Integrity Section, Cuellar's relationship to Azerbaijan is well documented, and indeed it is. In fact, he had gone to Azerbaijan back in 2013, and this was a trip that was paid for by a group that has gotten into significant amounts of trouble since. So in 2013, January 2013 to be exact, Cuellar and his spouse flew to Turkey and Azerbaijan on a trip sponsored by an entity calling itself the Turquoise Council of Americans and Eurasians. The trip for the Cuellars cost just south of $20,000 and was approved by the House Ethics Committee. Kamal Oksus, listed as Turquoise Council president, told the Ethics Committee that this is important, no foreign money paid for the trip, according to disclosures. But it turns out that that claim that no foreign money paid for that trip might be questionable. Now, nothing has been proven in regard to that particular trip yet. But here's what we know about this organization known as the Turquoise Council and how it got implicated with foreign money later. So in 2018, Oksus pleaded guilty to concealing that a separate congressional trip in May of 2013 to Azerbaijan had been funded by SOCAR, the state oil company of Azerbaijan, a wholly owned national oil and gas company. Oksus had claimed that the trip in question was paid for the Turquoise Council, and that the embassy of the Friends of Azerbaijan also paid for this, both of which purport to promote regional and transnational cooperation. But it turns out that there was, in fact, foreign money flowing to these organizations, right? So Oksus, for his part in this, was actually sentenced back in 2019. He was convicted, All right, so now here's what we know. Court documents show that Oxus wired $750,000 from SOCAR, remember that is the oil company in Azerbaijan, in order to organize travel for 10 House members and their staff to Azerbaijan. Now, Cuellar did not go on this second trip. Prior to this deposit, the Assembly of the Friends of Azerbaijan, one of the nonprofits involved in the travel scheme, had only $283.15 in its checkings account. So it's important to understand where the funding for these organizations come from, because since it is foreign money, which then was transferred over to members of Congress for these trips, laws were broken. Believe it or not, even in the United States, where legalized bribery reigns supreme, there are still some restrictions, some limitations, especially as it pertains to foreign money. You don't want foreign governments paying off or bribing our elected officials, at least for now. Who knows what the future holds? We are, of course, the United States, one of the most corrupt countries in the world. Now, here's what we know so far. SOCAR is the largest company and source of tax revenue in Azerbaijan. So this is an incredibly important source of revenue for the country. The company has embarked on ambitious plans to build a network of pipelines that stretch through multiple countries to deliver gas to Europe. The so-called Southern Gas Corridor, built by SOCAR in partnership with BP and other Western energy giants, required an investment of over $45 billion. Now, in comes Cuellar. This is where Cuellar might be implicated. And remember, the FBI is not willing to just go in and raid a US member of Congress unless there is significant evidence, unless there's, of course, probable cause. The reason they were able to do these raids in both the home and office of Henry Cuellar's is because they have probable cause and they have reason to believe that there might be some wrongdoing, maybe some campaign finance issues at play. And this is what we know, okay? In September of 2013, Cuellar and other lawmakers sponsored a resolution in Congress expressing support for Azerbaijan's Southern Gas Corridor project, stating that it was in the US national interest to support construction and work closely with the governments of Turkey, Azerbaijan, Georgia, and others in the region to have the pipeline completed. So, how so? How does this serve the US interest? Seems like it only serves Azerbaijan's interest. And considering the ties that Cuellar has had with Azerbaijan, both in the form of going on these trips and possibly the funneling of foreign money, again, possible, that hasn't been confirmed yet with Cuellar, seems like he's not really concerned about the US interests at play. It seems like he's interested in his own financial incentives here. Because again, why would it benefit the United States or the citizens of the United States for Azerbaijan to be able to, succeed in this pipeline that they're trying to build, by the way, through multiple countries? And Armenia comes into play as well, because if you can recall, we had talked about the Nagorno-Karabakh conflict where Azerbaijan essentially invaded Nagorno-Karabakh and basically got rid of Armenians who had been living there in those homes for years. And it looks like Cuellar was very much involved in preventing humanitarian aid from getting to Armenians who had been displaced as a result of that conflict. I'll get to that in just a second. But here's what Cuellar did and how he succeeded in convincing Congress to go along with what Azerbaijan wanted here. So Cuellar pushed for a resolution, essentially to support Azerbaijan in its pipeline. The resolution was adopted by the House Foreign Affairs Committee by unanimous consent. In 2020, a portion of the pipeline across the Adriatic Sea began commercial operations to deliver gas from Azerbaijan to Italy. Cuellar's corruption on behalf of the Azerbaijani oil company continued for years to come. It didn't just stop there. So for instance, in April of 2015, Cuellar announced an affiliation agreement between Texas A&M International University and the Assembly of the Friends of Azerbaijan, described in a Cuellar press release as an educational and cultural organization, but which we now know by Oxus's admittance that it was a front for the Azerbaijani oil company. Okay, so they're going into universities, you have Cuellar, speaking up on their behalf, passing resolutions to support this pipeline. It's insane, absolutely insane. And here are some other things to keep in mind. Oxus was also a massive campaign donor for Cuellar. To give you one example, Cuellar received $1,000 from Oxus in June of 2012 and another $2,500 in February of 2015. These are just direct campaign donations to Cuellar by someone who's now convicted of funneling foreign money to Congress. Very nice. And getting back to that issue of Nagorno-Karabakh and the Armenians who were displaced from that region, well, Cuellar, a co-chair of the Congressional Azerbaijan Caucus, do you guys know that even existed, that there was a Congressional Azerbaijan Caucus, continued to promote Azerbaijan's interests. Following the devastating Armenia-Azerbaijan war in 2020, fought over the disputed Nagorno-Karabakh region, Cuellar petitioned his congressional colleagues to ensure that any humanitarian aid for the conflict would be provided through the government of Azerbaijan. Okay, let's stop for a second. So Azerbaijan, which invades and displaces Armenians from Nagorno-Karabakh, is gonna be given the humanitarian aid to then give to the very people they victimized? How does that make any sense at all? It continues, to ensure that any humanitarian aid for the conflict would be provided through the government of Azerbaijan or UN organizations and not given directly to Armenia. So when you take a look at how our international relations work, when we consider why it is that we support some countries while engaging in humanitarian violations, human rights abuses in other countries like Yemen, for instance, I mean, you just have to follow the money. It is insane. Now, again, a lot of this is kind of up in the air right now. It isn't proven that Cuellar has taken foreign money just yet, and I want to be clear about that. But it appears that the very organizations that Cuellar was working with have in fact been implicated in funneling foreign money, Azerbaijani money, to members of Congress in order to lobby support for a pipeline that was being constructed through several countries in that region. This is how foreign policy works. This is what foreign policy is, okay? All this nonsense that Americans hear about regarding, we want to make sure that we're policing the world, that we're spreading democracy, that we're protecting humans from human rights abuses, it's nonsense. Because as you can see, while we simultaneously spout that nonsense, we're also committing our own human rights abuses at our border, our own human rights abuses by assisting with the Saudi-backed destruction in Yemen. I mean, the examples go on and on. We engage in orchestrating coups in Latin American countries that have democratically elected leaders that we just don't like, because we want to make sure that they don't nationalize their resources. We want to make sure that our business interests can take full advantage of those resources. I mean, this is just incredibly disgusting behavior. I mean, you have Cuellar without all of this scandal. Cuellar, who is a corporate Democrat, an individual who voted along with Trump more often than most people even realize, someone who claims to be a Democrat but seems to agree quite a bit with the worst elements of the Republican Party. I mean, I'm glad he's being primaried. I'm glad that Jessica Cisneros is going at it again, and she came very close to defeating him in the last primary, and I hope she defeats him. I hope that he's successfully primaried, because this is a guy who clearly, regardless of whether all of this gets proven or not, is only in it for the money, in it for himself, in it because he's a narcissistic egomaniac who has no position representing anyone, much less the best interests of Texans. So for Democrats who live in his district, take a good hard look at who Cuellar really is. Take a good hard look at who he's telling you he is. Because it doesn't matter, he can be bought by anyone, including Azerbaijan, which I'm sure he doesn't really care about at all, but as long as they're paying up, that money speaks. Clearly, he's interested in promoting anything as long as his campaign coffers benefit from what he's promoting. So we'll see how this story develops. I'm very curious to see how it goes, but I'm glad that we have a few more details about what that raid might have been about. Once we have more details, of course, we'll share them with you. For now, though, we're going to take a quick break, and when we come back, Latasha Brown, co-founder of Black Voters Matter, will be joining us. She'll be talking to us about the voting rights bill, its fate, and what activists and organizers are planning to do moving forward. We'll be right back. Welcome back to TYT. Let's get to our next story. Voter suppression laws have passed in several red states and swing states, even states where Donald Trump won the 2020 general election. One of those states happens to be Iowa, where Trump actually won over Biden with more than 53% of the vote. But local politicians in Iowa would have you believe that, voter fraud's a real problem. So does that mean that the outcome of the 2020 election in their state wasn't valid? Well, what are they doing? Well, it turns out that they, like other states, including Georgia and Florida, have passed all sorts of provisions that make it harder for voters to cast their ballot. For instance, 4 months after Iowans voted in record numbers, Governor Kim Reynolds has signed legislation cutting the state's early voting period and closing the polls an hour earlier on Election Day. The law cuts Iowa's early voting period from 29 days to 20 days. Polls will now close at 8 p.m. for state and federal elections instead of 9 p.m. So if you happen to be a worker in the state of Iowa who likes to vote on the same day of the election and you end up working a little late that day, that 1 hour cutoff might make all the difference, but seems like that's the point. Let me give you more. Some ballots used to be counted, some ballots that used to be counted will not be counted anymore. For instance, ballots must now arrive by the time polls close in order to be counted. Previously, ballots placed in the mail the day before Election Day could be counted as long as they arrived by noon the following Monday. That is not the rule anymore. Now there is a stricter cutoff, but they didn't stop there. The law strips auditors of much of their discretion in running elections in their counties. Auditors may no longer establish satellite in-person early voting sites unless petitioned to do so by residents. So instead of the auditors being, proactive and making it easier and accessible for voters to cast their ballot, they can't do anything unless residents organize and demand it. You guys see the problem here? Right? I mean, you're supposed to live in a democracy where the state makes it easy for you to cast your ballot as long as you're an eligible voter, but they're making it increasingly difficult. They're putting all these obstacles in place. Let me give you some more from that graphic. Auditors may no longer establish satellite in-person early voting sites unless petitioned to do so by residents, and they may not mail absentee ballot request forms to voters unless a voter asks for one. The law also limits who can return a voter's absentee ballot. Only the voter, an immediate family member, household member, or caregiver may return the ballot to the auditor's office or place it in the mail. Previously, anyone the voter designated could deliver the ballot on the voter's behalf, but the new law makes it a serious misdemeanor for any unauthorized person to do so. And by the way, the law also limits ballot drop-off boxes. So if you do want to do early voting and drop it off at a ballot drop-off box, the options will be very limited. The law allows counties to establish just one ballot drop-off box at the auditor's office under video surveillance, of course. Which is interesting because these new restrictions would make you believe that there were maybe cases of voter fraud, widespread voter fraud. Again, the state where Trump won with more than 53% of the vote. Like, we know what's happening here. It's very clear that they're putting obstacles and restrictions in place to make it increasingly difficult for people to vote. Now, with that said, Senator Joni Ernst from the state of Iowa was asked about these restrictions, and her answer was incredibly stupid. Let's watch.
According to the Brennan Center, which enacted laws at the 19 states which enacted laws that make it harder to vote, in Iowa that includes significantly shortening the early voting period and closing voting sites an hour earlier. How do those changes make voting any more secure?
Well, it is the same level of security.
How does that make any sense at all? That makes no sense. Zero. And if you think that conservatives are done, remember there is a well-funded, organized strategy here to make it difficult for people to vote. One of the organizations behind it is Heritage Action. This is a national conservative group, and it announced that it would spend $10 million across 8 states, including Iowa, to run advertising, mobilize volunteers, and work with state lawmakers to promote legislation limiting use of absentee ballots, requiring voter ID, verifying voter citizenship, and requiring verification of the accuracy of voter registration lists. So all of that is relevant, especially when we discuss the federal government's effort to pass a voting rights bill, something that was blocked by Republicans in the Senate because the legislative filibuster remains in place. And then when Democrats attempted to reform the filibuster to allow for the passage of a voting rights bill with a simple majority, 2 corporate Democrats, Senators Kyrsten Sinema and Joe Manchin, stood in the way. And now there's some question as to what the Biden administration plans to do. Here to help me talk about this situation and what we can plan to do moving forward is LaTosha Brown. She's the co-founder of Black Voters Matter, and I'm very excited to speak with her. LaTosha, thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you for having me.
So I wanted to start off by asking you, to kind of give your response to what's happening in states like Iowa right now.
I want people to understand that what's happening right now is that we are seeing the punishment of voters in this country, that there's a new American voter, and there are some that are very upset about that. I want people to understand that up until recently, the baby boomers, who my parents came out of the baby boomer generation, they dominated the political landscape. They had the numbers. I'm from Generation X. We never had the numbers. When you're looking at from the millennial generation on down to Generation Z, and that you all now, young voters are the largest constituency base in the country. And so there is an effort. What we saw in the 2020 election, there were more young people, there are more communities of color, there are more African-American voters that voted in this country's history, that ever voted in this country history, including new voters. And so there is an attack on literally this electoral process being expanded because voters came out and voted in record numbers. There's this effort to suppress the vote all across the board again. And so what we're seeing, it's a playbook. I always talk about there's been 3 strategies that have always been used as part of voter suppression. One, there's always been a strategy around specifically restricting access to the ballot, just as you talked about in Iowa, what's happening in Georgia, what's happening all across this nation. There's no logic behind why would you want to take an hour off having people have access to vote? Like, how does that make the process safer? Or literally creating a shorter period of time for absentee ballot voting. The second strategy has always been around creating this culture of fear. And so what we're seeing right now is we're seeing states like in Florida, where the governor of Florida is saying that he's going to create a special police force to oversee elections, to create this sense of fear. We're also seeing that in Georgia, where there's a law that was passed, the SB 202, that actually criminalizes organizations for literally makes it a crime for an organization to hand out water. And so there's always been the second strategy that is literally there's access, restricting access, also making sure that you're creating the culture of fear. And the third, which is the most egregious, which we're seeing in Iowa, we're seeing in Georgia, we're seeing all across this nation, and that is weaponizing the administrative process to actually create a process so that the ruling party can actually go in and overturn the results. They can take over election boards. They can actually do major changes to the electoral process, even if they throw it out if they don't like the results. And so what we're seeing right now, there's a complete attack on voters who participated in this last election that are making up this new electorate, this new multiracial, multi-generational electorate that is rising up. And we're seeing this all across the board. That's why we really have to focus on how we're going to make sure we're strengthening our democracy.
So let's talk about that because, there was this assumption that the one thing the Democratic Party would fight for and would fight for aggressively would be the passage of a voting rights bill, because we know that most politicians are motivated by incentives and disincentives. And in this case, the future of the Democratic Party really does rely on ensuring that we protect our elections, that we reform our elections, make sure that it's accessible to eligible voters. But what we saw, in my opinion, from the Biden administration was a pretty pathetic and tepid response. This nonsense about how, oh, well, what can we do? We did our best and we applied pressure, kind of, not really, but it's Manchin and Sinema's fault. But you look at the carrots that Biden has used toward Manchin, giving Manchin's wife a nice cushy job that she wanted, federal appointment. You look at the complimentary rhetoric coming from Biden in response to people like Kyrsten Sinema, and one must wonder what kind of pressure really was applied. It doesn't seem like the Biden administration really fought for this at all. Do you agree, or do you have a different take?
Let me say this. We have been pretty open about and had an open critique. We've protested at the White House precisely because we've been thinking that, that this was not as core a critical issue for the White House as it needed to be. In fairness to the president, it's not something that I don't think that he supports. I actually believe that he supports voting rights. I believe that the Democrats support, the majority of the Democrats support voting rights. And I also don't want to let the Republicans off the hook on this as well. That literally people may or may not know that there were 16 Republicans that voted for the reauthorization of the Voting Rights Act, that are now, where are they? Like, we can't let them off the hook. One, we have to hold the Democrats accountable, but we also have to hold the Republicans accountable as well. And so while there's been certainly a lot of frustration around, we wanted to see the White House come out, this administration come out much earlier. What we asked him for, what we asked him to do, what we saw is in the recent weeks that it seems like there's been more energy and more effort come to the White House. What I think it's going to take, I think if we're going to have democracy in this country, that we as voters, we're going to have to organize to hold all of our elected officials accountable and not even see this. We have to see this beyond just a Democratic Party or party power issue. It is fundamentally an issue. If voters participate and then they are punished because they participated, then that in itself is political corruption. So we have to see the core of what is problematic in this process. And so, yes, we have to continue to hold their feet to the fire, put pressure on the Democrats to actually be able to deliver. I think that Schumer and others, I think some of what being able to get that vote on the floor, that Sinema and Manchin could no longer just run and hide and lie, because I think they've been disingenuous. I actually think that was a smart move. What we need to see right now, that right now we're currently in a power struggle in this country. There's a small group of people who have decided that they want this country to move forward by being divisive, where only a small group of people will control it, that they're basing their entire campaign on lies and division. And so there are more of us, I believe, in this nation when we're looking at from our communities, multiracial, multi-generational, that actually believe in something different and better and want this country to be more inclusive, more equitable, and more democratic. In order for that to take place, it is going to have to take us also being very engaged in this process. We can no longer just leave it up to the politicians. We're going to have to put pressure on them, and we're going to have to demand that we have voting rights legislation in this country.
Well, to that point, when Biden gave a speech in Atlanta about the importance of passing a voting rights bill, organizations, activists, including, if I remember correctly, Black Voters Matter, decided to boycott that speech. And I thought that was actually incredibly powerful. Was there any response from the White House in regard to the actions that organizers took?
Well, I think a couple of things. One, we did hear from the White House, but then secondly, our goal, we didn't try to organize other people not to go to that. We wanted just to send a message loud and clear that this is game on, that this is time to pass the legislation, that we need, the speech is nice, but we need to make sure that the actions line up for that. And so in fairness, I think that some of the things that he raised in his speech, he himself, the president himself, said that he had been silent too long and that he was going to use the full weight of his office, which is essentially what we've been asking for. I think that at this juncture where we are right now, what we're going to have to see, and we're going to have to turn up the pressure so that this administration knows that we are literally demanding that we have voting rights legislation going forward. But I also want to make sure that we as voters recognize that part of what got us here is not engaging in the process. Anytime people are making decisions for us and we're not engaged in this process, this is what happens. And so we have to literally lean in and engage. I hope that there are more young people that will run for public office. I think we need to make sure that we are not equalizing like, okay, there's a Republican Party and the Democratic Party. Right now, we actually see a party that is anti-democratic, a party that literally is that is racist, that is standing on a platform that's being racist. And so at the end of the day, what we have to do is completely reimagine and reshape the political landscape in this country. We have to be unapologetic about taking power and demanding that people have power. And that's going to require young people, that's going to require communities of color standing in the gap and literally pushing for this legislation as well as other policy changes in this nation.
For audience members who want to be engaged, who want to join in this fight, what advice would you give them? How can they do so?
So there are three things I'll say quickly, and then the first thing is you need a political home. This is not hands off season. This is the moment that literally, and I'm not saying this as hyperbole, but this literally our democratic future is being shaped right now. There are decisions being made right now about us and our families and policy in this family. How is it that we don't have, when we're looking at healthcare, how is it that we're paying for senators who are wealthy? We're paying for them to have the best healthcare plan in the country, yet they don't want people in this country to have health care. That is unacceptable. And so we have to shift this moment. And one way to do that is we need every single person to find a political home. Get engaged in an organization, whether you're writing a check, whether you're volunteering. We need more people who are literally a part of the electoral process. There are poll workers. If you can volunteer to be a poll worker, to make sure that you're volunteering for the camp for elections on election day, we need more young people in those positions of power. We need more young people to run for office, right? And we need more people to actually read and connect with their communities to really understand the issues that we care about and lift this up. I think one of our most critical fights that we're in right now is around voting rights. If people want to find out what they can do around voting rights, more work they can do, they can visit our website on www.blackvotersmatterfund.org. We have toolkits to really be able to share some of the work that we're doing. We're calling for 1 million voters, 1 million people who are supporting voting rights. We've got to build a critical mass. We've got to put the pressure. We've got to use our power and make sure that this nation is the nation that we desire and that we deserve.
One final question for you, because you got me fired up, and I'm curious what you think about a possible progressive primary challenge to the Biden administration in 2020. Is that something that you think would be a positive way to maybe, light a fire under the Biden administration, or do you think that it's too divisive?
I think at this point, I think part of what has to happen, I think the Republicans, let me say in fairness, while I've been a critic of the Biden administration, let me say that the Biden administration has done some good things. Like we cannot undermine what has happened with the child tax credit. We cannot minimize what has happened, even with the infrastructure. I think I'm raising that because I think it's important for us to recognize the nuance moment that we're in. In this moment, what we have to do is voters themselves have to get in a position of power that if we come out in record numbers, we can literally shift the people who are in power, whatever direction we want to shift them in. That's how we actually translate power. At this point, I think my goal is not to how do we just see it as a failure. I think part of what the Republicans have been they have been obstructionists on purpose. Let me tell you who this lies in. This actually is at the feet, while I've been a critic of the Biden administration because of timing, right? Not because I don't believe that they actually are in alignment or they support it. It's around timing and priority that I've been a critic around. Mm-hmm. But the truth of the matter is we are literally in one of the largest fights of our lives, that there is a party right now that is seeking to be obstructionist, so much so that they're going to be against anything, because part of what they want is they want to get in power by having us being so frustrated that we're divided. They also want to be in power by having us be divided and seeing ourselves and our interests as separate, when the bottom line is I certainly think that there are more Americans who want to see a multicultural, multiracial, multi-generational movement going forward, so that all of us recognize we all want the same things. We want quality education. We want healthcare. We want fair and decent wages. We want to literally be able to live a quality of life. That's what we want. Mm-hmm. And so there has to be a critical mass of us that are willing to push whoever is in office to do that. I think that is what our focus should be. Our focus should be on how do we organize our power in the streets? How do we organize our power as young people, as communities of color, and literally be in a position that we can actually put the pressure points where they need to go.
All right. LaTosha Brown, co-founder of Black Voters Matter. Thank you so much for taking the time to speak with us today. Really appreciate it.
Thank you for having me.
All right, we're going to take a brief break. When we come back, we'll get into the current escalations with Russia. Come right back. What's up, everyone? Welcome back to TYT. Anna Kasparian with you. And let's get to our next story. This one's a doozy, lots of nuance, pretty complex, but I hope you stay with me. So, As tensions continue to escalate between Russia and Ukraine, the United States and NATO have sprung into action, and I would argue not in such a great way, indicating that conflict with Russia might be imminent. Now let's start off with NATO forces and what they're doing, and then we'll get to the United States. NATO said Monday, meaning today, that it would send additional ships and fighter jets to Eastern Europe as Britain ordered some diplomats and their families to leave Ukraine amid growing alarm that Russia may invade as it masses tens of thousands of troops near its border. Okay, so I just want you guys to ask yourselves why they are doing that, because the narrative in the United States is that they're doing it as a way to prepare for an invasion into Ukraine. But I would also ask you to look into the provocations by NATO for quite some time now that might have also persuaded them to protect its borders. I'm not a huge fan of Vladimir Putin. I think that's pretty clear. But I think that we're getting one side of the story here. And one thing that's really important to also look at is the comments coming from Ukraine. Remember, Ukraine is the alleged victim here, right? Ukraine is apparently dealing with a serious threat here. But the comments in some of these stories, which of course are buried in like paragraph 28, tell you something a little different. And I just ask to be detailed in your analysis here. So let me give you more. Members, meaning NATO members, are putting forces on standby and sending additional ships and fighter jets to NATO deployments in Eastern Europe, reinforcing allied deterrence and defense as Russia continues its military buildup in and around Ukraine. All right. So what about the United States? Well, the latest news as we speak about this is that as many as 8,500 US troops have been put on heightened notice for possible deployment to Eastern Europe. Also, US Secretary of Defense Lloyd Austin has issued a warning to essentially prepare for deployment at the direction of President Joe Biden. And this is the latest step that the US has taken to prepare for potential war, a potential Russian invasion. The US is also considering cutting off Russia from, this is considered the nuclear option, no pun intended, cutting off Russia from the global financial system. Essentially, the Treasury Department would do that. And if they do that, it's very similar to what happened to Iran. It would be catastrophic for Russia's economy, more importantly, for the people of Russia. Let me give you more. Germany is also considering ending its partnership with Russia by cutting off the Nord Stream 2 pipeline, gas pipeline. So there's a lot at stake for Russia. Again, it could be cut off from the global economy. It could be cut off from this lucrative pipeline deal with Germany. And the way that this is being reported on would have you believe that Russia invading Ukraine is imminent. Like they're preparing, they're gonna do it any day now. But Ukraine has a different take. Now, the United States on Sunday ordered families of diplomats to leave Kiev and ordered non-essential diplomatic staff to also leave. The State Department also cautioned American citizens to consider leaving Ukraine, with US officials warning that an attack could happen at any time. But what's really going on? Well, Ukrainian officials, including the leader of Ukraine, is telling the people of Ukraine, like, this seems pretty scary, but calm down because the threat is not as serious as the United States would have you believe. In fact, one official from Ukraine says, while we respect the right of foreign states to ensure the security of their diplomatic missions, we consider such steps by the American side to be premature and sign of excess caution. Ukraine Foreign Ministry spokesperson Oleg Nikolenko said in a statement. In fact, there have been no cardinal changes in the security situation recently, he added, noting that the concentration of Russian forces on Ukraine's borders began last April. So he's like, I mean, yeah, I guess the US can do what it wants to do, but like, we don't really see a change in our security. Like why are things escalating all of a sudden? Let me give you more. Now, my take is that the United States has been intentionally crossing what's been referred to as Russia's red line, Putin's red line, and it really has to do with NATO. The heart of this conflict, I mean, the media in the United States would have you believe that it's all about Russia wanting to invade Ukraine. But Russia has been increasingly frustrated with the United States and with NATO. And its red line is the possibility of Ukraine joining NATO. They don't want that. They see that as a provocation. That gets left out of the conversation. And if you look at the history of the United States and its relationship to Russia, this has been a point of conflict for a long time. In fact, the United States has reneged on its promises to avoid expanding NATO. NATO is a relic of the Soviet era, right? It was a response to the Soviet Union during the Cold War. And there was this promise by both the George H.W. Bush administration and the Bill Clinton administration to stop expanding NATO after the collapse of the Soviet Union. Well, the Soviet Union collapsed, and guess what? They continued expanding. And that has been a provocative move by NATO and the United States, of course. And for a long time, Russia's kind of given a side eye to that. But the possibility of Ukraine joining NATO is seen as more provocative because NATO shares a border with, Ukraine shares a border with Russia. So that's one of the reasons why Russia sees it as incredibly provocative. Since they see it as provocative, they've been gathering their troops and their military capability at the border. They see it as defensive, whereas the United States and NATO sees it as offensive. Let me give you more. Branko Marcetic, in my opinion, has written the best comprehensive pieces on this conflict. It's very real, it gives you the historical context necessary to understand the conflict, and it's certainly more fair than anything you're gonna read in the Washington Post or the New York Times. In a piece that he wrote in Jacobin back in December of last year, he said, when the Cold War ended and the Soviet Union dissolved, there was ostensibly no more use for NATO. And both the George H.W. Bush and Bill Clinton administrations told Russian leadership that the alliance wouldn't expand eastward. But guess what? It continued to expand. In fact, privately, Bush's Pentagon urged Washington to leave the door ajar for Eastern European membership down the line, which is exactly what they did, under criticism from no less than Robert Gates, defense secretary for both Bush's son and Barack Obama, and George Kennan, the father of US anti-communist policy of containment. So they got criticism from people who have not been pro-Russia. Like, yo, you promised not to expand, eastward with the NATO alliances, you continue to do it, and this is gonna be counterproductive. Sure enough, it ended up being pretty counterproductive. Between 1999 and 2020, 14 countries joined the alliance, all of them from Eastern Europe, and 2 of them scraping right up against the Russian border. Kennan had worried this would inflame the nationalistic, anti-Western, and militaristic tendencies in Russian opinion and impel Russian foreign policy in a direction decidedly not to our liking, as Marcetic writes, which, looking back in hindsight, is pretty spot on. Now, while Russia hated the expansion of NATO, the inclusion, again, of Ukraine has been a red line because of the fact that they share a border, okay? That gets left out of the conversation. Just take a look at this map. This is from the Washington Post that shows you the border that they share. Yes, Russia did annex Crimea in 2014, and I would venture to say that the situation now is a little different, okay? There were certainly separatists in Crimea who wanted to be part of Russia rather than Ukraine. People disagree with what Russia did. I think that there's valid, that's a valid thought. But right now, we need to also consider what Russia stands to lose if it invaded Ukraine. It stands to lose a lot. Its economy is in shambles already. You have the United States already, implementing all sorts of sanctions against Russia. They want to take it a step further with the possible nuclear option of cutting Russia off from the global economy, which would mean that it would be in the same state that Iran is in, which is a complete and utter disaster. Again, the people of Iran are really suffering. They're bearing the brunt of US aggression toward the country, and the same will be true of Russia if Russia does really show any real evidence of wanting to invade Ukraine. Again, you can argue, and I would say that this is actually the case, that Russia is responding to NATO aggression by getting its troops ready at the border because they're concerned about Ukraine getting military weaponry from the United States, joining NATO, which they see as a provocation. Everything the US has done, everything that NATO has done, has not really helped. It's only escalated the situation. Rather than approach this in possible diplomatic ways, everything the US has done has actually been pretty aggressive. Some might argue that sanctions aren't a form of war, but it is. It is a form of war, especially sanctions that harm the Russian people. So we're also, by the way, this is important, meddling in Russian elections, which is an important point that gets left out of all the reporting you see on this situation. And it should be an important point to bring up, considering we spent so much time reporting on and showing concern for Russian meddling in the US election. In May of 2021, US officials were tricked into admitting on camera that they have a very, very active program throughout Russia and were targeting the country's legislative elections, meaning this political meddling is still going on. So the way, again, that this is being reported makes it seem like Russia bad, US and NATO good. But that's not the case. It's way more nuanced than that. And the aggression by the United States and NATO is worth noting because that's how you understand some of the decisions that are being made by the Kremlin. We should also be concerned about war with two nuclear countries here, right? Washington and Moscow alone own around 90% of the world's nuclear warheads, or a little more than 8,000 stockpiled between them, with around 2,000 of them on high operational alert. This is more than enough to annihilate each other and human civilization as a whole. Kind of relevant to the discussion, no? Because everywhere you go right now in corporate media, the war drums are being like they're hitting the war drums, like they can't wait for a possible US invasion of Russia, which would be absolutely insane. Rather than saying, hey, why don't we take a step back and really assess what's at stake here? We're putting 8,500 US troops on alert for possible deployment to Eastern Europe. How is that a smart idea? It's really incredible stuff. And just to give you one example of one of the doofuses in corporate media that's beating the war drums, we've got Joe Scarborough, who tweeted, "The Russians see our retreat from Afghanistan as a green light to invade Ukraine. China sees American passivity toward Ukraine as a green light to invade Taiwan. Regardless of the US's ultimate position, this is the reality the White House faces." No, that's not the reality the White House faces. Notice how he included the failed 20-year Afghanistan war in that critique of the US government. You know, the problem with the United States is not that it engages in preemptive wars, not that it orchestrates coups in Latin American countries, not that it is assisting in the Saudi-led brutality in Yemen, the famine that's killing millions of children. No, that's not the problem. The problem is we're not engaging in enough war. I mean, I would venture to say we're not engaging in enough diplomacy. We're not listening to what the red line is for Putin and Russia, right? Why are we continuing to expand NATO when they see that as a provocation, when they see that as a cause for possible war? It's just, I get it, it's tough. It's really tough when you're feuding with someone to take a step back and say, all right, maybe I shouldn't do this next thing that I really want to do, that knee-jerk reaction, because it's gonna further escalate the conflict here. But the United States is like, military conflict, yes, sign me up. And by the way, the people making the decision here to put those 8,500 US troops on high alert for possible deployment aren't gonna send their own kids. They're gonna send your kids. Or if you're currently an active member of the military, they're gonna send you. But who cares? Just more American lives to fight nonsense wars that could be prevented through other means. And I do want to end with 2 more graphics here, because Matt Duss, who is an excellent person to follow on Twitter if you want to know what's going on with foreign policy, he's actually a foreign policy advisor for Bernie Sanders. He had a really great point. He says, comparing the intensity of coverage of Ukraine and Afghanistan to the lack of coverage of the far more serious threat of global vaccine inequality offers a window into the US's misguided and militaristic foreign policy debate. And I couldn't agree more. And finally, for those who think that the United States is best suited to police the globe and allegedly protect countries like Ukraine, let me just remind you of the track record that the United States has. Washington has launched an illegal invasion of Iraq that destroyed the country and destabilized the wider region, set up a global network of secret torture prisons, and kidnapped people off the streets of even Western countries to fill them, carried out regime change war in Libya, further destabilizing the region and reducing the country to violent anarchy. Oh, we're not done yet though. As Marcia Teach continues to write in the piece, unilaterally imposed crippling sanctions on Iran and Venezuela in defiance of the United Nations, consistently threatened another war against Iran. By the way, remember all the lies they told about Iran and all the aggression that the United States was engaging in toward Iran? Just something to keep in mind. Pulling out of an international agreement and assassinating one of its top officials, and backed or fomented coups in several different Latin American countries. Venezuela, you have Bolivia. These are the more recent ones. Of course, the Venezuelan coups failed, the Bolivian coup succeeded. That's what the United States is engaged in. And I know I keep repeating it, but we're also engaged in all sorts of human rights abuses in Yemen. Because as long as we're dealing with an ally like the wonderful Saudi Arabia, all of a sudden human rights abuses, we don't really care. We can just toss those concerns out the window. Look, this is not to say that Putin's a good guy. This is not a segment meant to support Russia. This is about allowing cooler heads to prevail and not falling for the same rhetoric, the same narratives that we hear over and over again when corporate media is beating the war drums and when the government is trying to make it seem as though there's another boogeyman, another massive threat that we need to be engaged with. It's absolute nonsense. We need to be smarter this time around. Don't fall for the corporate media narrative on this. Make sure you get to paragraph 28 in the Washington Post, where you actually hear from officials from Ukraine and get a sense of how overblown the narratives are here in the US. We got to take a break. We'll be right back.
Thanks for listening to the full episode of The Young Turks. Support our work, listen ad-free, access members-only bonus content, and more by subscribing to Apple Podcasts at apple.co/TYT. I'm your host, Cenk Uygur, and I'll see you soon.